the more people you have out there trying to come up with some new spin on it or some new analysis of it, the more that we have these sort of intense pile-ons to stories and then these very intense abandonments of them.
New York Times Magazine editor Bill Wasik today on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson. Breaking news. This just in. Major new development. Did I catch your attention? I probably did. But how do you know if I have actual news or if I'm just bloviating? Well, it's getting harder and harder to tell the difference. How do you know when you find something on the web, whether it is of substance, something real and breaking, or if it's just some random guy commenting on the latest rumor from a webcam in his mom's basement? Well, the New York Times Magazine editor Bill Wasik identified this phenomenon 16 years ago in a book that he called And Then There's This. Now, 16 years ago, in 2009, Twitter and YouTube and Facebook were still pretty young. TikTok didn't exist, and podcasting was still relatively new. So the phenomenon has just grown much, much bigger since this interview that you're about to hear. Bill Wasik and I met one afternoon in July of 2009 to talk about his book. In just a moment, our conversation.
They say what's old is new again. You're about to see if that's true as you listen to an interview from noted radio personality Bill Thompson's 30-year archive. Enjoy.
So here now, from 2009, Bill Wasik.
I've actually used this phrase, and then there's this, to do that cute little story that everybody's going to be talking about for the next, 10 or 12 hours, maybe a day or two, and then it just falls off the radar as fast as it came on the radar. Is that what you're talking about here?
No, absolutely. It's funny because the title didn't come to me until very, very late in the production process of the book. But then once I hit on it, and I realized it just captured perfectly what it is that I'm trying to talk about. And because part of what I'm arguing is that, we have always had that phenomenon, the phenomenon of the little story that's a distraction or a diversion. And part of what I'm arguing is in the era of the internet, it's become way more of a part of our daily conversation. And it isn't just about the weird news or that sort of thing, but it's like that whole way of thinking about news has filtered into the way we talk about politics and we talk about serious art and music and culture.
Just last week, as we sit here in the second week of July, Mark Sanford was all over the news. Oh, what are we going to do about this governor who's gone to Argentina? He's now his mistress. And then, whoops, Sarah Palin resigned. What? Right. What? And now it's Mark who?
Well, exactly. My argument isn't that, something like, crazy adultery by the governor of South Carolina or the resignation of the former vice presidential nominee of the Republican Party aren't big stories, because clearly they are. What I find interesting is the way that we obsess over these stories so vigorously for these very, very brief, intense windows of time. And so there's a sense that the oxygen burns up out of them, in these tiny little windows. So right now it's Sarah Palin, and it isn't just the normal kind of average speculation that we would have about why she made this mysterious decision. It's well, here are 10 different theories about why she did it, and here's what it symbolizes, her fall from grace, and here's maybe her trajectory will remember Nixon. No, it's more like Reagan. No, it's more it's. To me, this is almost mathematics, by which I mean the more people you have out there trying to, A, find novelty, and B, trying to come up with some new spin on it or some new analysis of it, some new twist or turn on it, the more that we have these sort of intense pile-ons to stories and then these very intense sort of abandonments of them.
Well, and they become even more intense because, as you point out in the book, instead of 100 people writing about it or broadcasting it, now we've got 100,000 people all looking for their own little niche angle to it.
No, that's exactly right, and that's actually a point I was actually planning to make tonight at my reading, which is that I think that when I talk about my book, people often seize on the ephemeral nature of the stories that I'm describing and the fact that they're around for only a short time, which is true. That's sort of the main thrust of how I describe them. But I also think you're right that it isn't just the speed of the dismissal of the stories. It's also the intensity with which we attack them and analyze them and throw them around. And this to me speaks to a sort of interesting sort of point when people talk about the internet, where people sort of say, the internet lets us all find our own little thing that's different from everybody else's thing. So you have The Long Tail, which is Chris Anderson's, justly very widely cited book about how the internet allows us to form niches and to find, for people who have very obscure interests, to find each other. There's a sense in which the internet allows us to segment and become sort of more everything sort of more exactly what we want, and it differentiates us from other people. But I also think that, there is still this basic human and societal need for us to talk about the same thing at the same time. And the internet, while it has allowed for all these subcultures to create, it also has allowed for this very, very intense, very, very national, very, immediate conversation to happen. And that to me is... that's sort of what the book is about, which is that what is it that we're all talking about? How is it that we're all talking about the same thing when in this new internet era? And the answer is, with more churn and with more speed and with more kind of intense craziness,
I wonder, does it take the death of a Michael Jackson to crash Twitter and to make us see just how connected we can still be at a moment like that?
In some ways, we have had some stories recently that have just been such big, sort of intrinsically big news that they kind of transcend this whole process of, the economic crisis being a classic example. It affects everybody. When it was unfolding, the scope of it and the speed of it was so astonishing that people had to kind of stop all this chatter and just focus on what was happening with the economy. And I think now you're seeing a fair amount of due deference being paid to the severity of the crisis and its after effects. By the same token, sure, somebody like Michael Jackson dies, a guy who's more than a celebrity, but who represented all of these incredible transformations in society. And there's a way in which, no amount of intense over-analysis of that event, it could, is going to be too much. In that, he was a real important figure. So to a certain extent, we're rescued from ourselves sometimes by actual events. But I think what you see happening is that when you don't have big news, you instead have all of this kind of manufactured chatter. The idea that if there is nothing important to talk about, if there's nothing of earth-shaking importance to talk about, then we need to invent things of earth-shaking importance to talk about. And that to me is what happens in the culture today.
Still, though, I suppose you could take the very rosy picture from that and say, you know what? If this nation really were if we were in an all-out war like World War II, where there was rationing and the draft and blackout curtains, things like that, we'd all be focused on that. Thank goodness that we can focus on trivial things and call them big news.
Well, that does those seem to be rose-colored glasses there. I think. To me, take something like climate change. Where on the one hand. We've done an admirably good job in the last 10 years of trying to refocus people's attention on the subject of climate change. But still, still, the number of people who believe that climate change is real and caused by humans has actually declined in the past decade. And to me, part of the reason why that's true is that it became part of this kind of partisan media war where, one side says, but you're talking about an underlying reality that can really only be explained and understood in terms of very, very small shifts in temperature and in climate in various places, and only very, very over very, very long periods of time. But of course, our minds don't work that way anymore if they ever did. And so instead it's sort of Al Gore has a movie where he says there's a problem. Or, even worse, and this is something that's amazing, which is, look, we had a cold day in July, therefore climate change can't be real. But then you have people on the other side saying, it's so hot in November and so climate change must be real. So when you allow yourself to slide into these kinds of like sensationalistic anecdotal treatments of these big stories, then you run the risk of losing people, because you can always counter one anecdote with another. You can always counter one little sensational piece of evidence with a very sensational piece of counter evidence. So that to me is the dichotomy, where it's there are these big important stories, but the problem is that it's like we're being wired through the always-on news and through all the cable and all, but then plus all this internet and all this amateur punditry. We're being wired to only be able to process it through these tiny little bursts of intense, outrageous attention, and that to me is dangerous.
After this short break, Bill Wasik explains the fundamental difference between this and what we used to have for news.
If you've ever wondered where to find the captivating books we discuss on Now I've Heard Everything, wonder no more.
Just tap the link in our show notes or visit our website, heardeverything.com.
Plus, when you purchase through our affiliate links, you're not only diving into great stories, but also supporting this podcast.
And we thank you for your support.
Now back to my 2009 conversation with Bill Wasik.
Now, how does what you just described differ from television that we've had for half a century?
Well, I mean, in television, you had a relatively small number of outlets that were really setting the conversation. I mean, shoot, you could go further back. I mean, in terms of the early history of radio, I mean, you've had overnight sensations as long as you've had mass media. The ability of people to find out about the same thing at exactly the same time is that almost inherently invents the desire to have national or international crazes, because that's part of the whole appeal of mass media. But I think that to me, the interactivity of the internet, the ability of so many people to get in on this conversation, and it's not just the internet; it's also cable news and satellite radio and all of the different professional outlets that we have now. I mean, I'd sort of come back to what I said earlier, which is that the more people that you have trying to create novelty, the more novelty that will be created, and the more quickly that any one piece of novelty is going to get sort of chewed up and spit out, because you can only chew over something, only so many mouths can chew it before. All right,
before we go further with that, but maybe that's another key to how this is different. I mean, there's an interactivity now that never existed with television.
Right. I mean, and so what you find is that I talked about Sarah Palin and the way that there were 10 different theories for why she did what she did. Well, those 10 different theories were aired over the course of just probably 12 to 18 hours by various bloggers, and not just unknown bloggers, but people who were either professional or sort of very well respected and had a big audience. And so that's sort of an example of what I'm talking about. If those sort of amateur media outlets and those immediate media outlets didn't exist, then it might have taken a few weeks for people to talk through all those possibilities and for the speculation to grow and build. The fewer voices that you have, the more time that it'll take for a conversation to develop. And now we have so many voices that the conversation happens, instantaneously.
Well, all right, let's go way back in the days of Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, when the open-air political debate was about the only live entertainment that people had in those days, and these guys would speak for hours at a time, and people would give their rapt attention to it. And now have we devolved through newspapers and then radio and then television and now the internet to where our attention span is we won't even listen to a 15-second speech anymore?
I hesitate to talk about this stuff in terms of like the individual attention span, or in terms of declining intelligence or declining engagement. Because the paradox is, you really do see the way that the internet has allowed people to become passionately engaged in politics in a way that they maybe wouldn't have been able to before. I mean, certainly the audience that exists for sort of 24-hour political news wonkery is probably never bigger than it's been today, and a lot of those people are able to follow very complex arguments. They're able to sift through a lot of data. It's so to me it's not a question of the individual attention span. To a certain level, what I'm talking about is a social attention span. I'm talking about the stuff that's available. We have an inherent social need to talk about not just the stuff of our own lives, but to talk about the world and to talk about and to try to feel like we're part of a society. I mean, that idea still exists. It's still intrinsic to us. My concern about what the internet's doing is it's making the stuff of that conversation, that bigger conversation about society, a lot smaller, a lot more ephemeral, a lot more dependent on really quick response and really quick analysis. That if you want to feel engaged with the world at large, you need to be incredibly fast and you need to be incredibly nimble. To a certain extent, it's increasing, you could argue, our individual intelligences and our ability to respond to things, but that what's being lost is a kind of social connectivity. There's a sense in which the stuff between us has gotten smaller.
Have we sacrificed depth for breadth?
Well, certainly in terms of following the news, I think that we are learning to respond to things very quickly and to think through all the possibilities and then discard the story and head on to the next one.
Which I suppose is not very troubling if we're talking about you and me, but I would hope that the people in charge of the country put more sober, rational, and deep thought and consideration into issues than just what they can get off the Huffington Post.
Let's hope so. And I will say that one of the things that I admire about President Obama and that I admired about him during the campaign is that I think that he was more effective than just about any other politician that I have seen at blunting the edge of some of this stuff. Obama, and partly it's just the sort of his charisma and the force of his personality, and part of it is the way that he thinks, but he can go out there, as he did during the campaign and as he has recently as president, and say, look, he said this just a couple of weeks ago, to the press, he said, look, you guys are on a 24-hour news cycle and I'm not. And that way of thinking and that realization that to a certain extent you can sort of, the emperor has no clothes, and somebody can essentially say to the media, look, you guys want an instant response. You want to know who my Supreme Court nominee is going to be. You want to know who, you want to know right now. I'm not going to tell you right now. And then to a certain extent, the news media just has to stop in its tracks and say, well, you know what, we can't chatter about this anymore because there are no leaks. There are no trial balloons being floated. We just have to wait for the decision to come down. That to me is a real, show of leadership. And I think that I hope that Obama throughout his administration will be able to keep that attitude towards the media up.
Is this a perpetual motion machine? Is it just going to keep getting faster and faster and faster and faster?
Well, certainly you look at something like Twitter where, you can only type 140 characters at once, but, the way that you develop a following is to extrude a lot of them, over the course of every single day of your life. That does seem to be almost the hypothetical endpoint of all of this. But, the flip side of it is, and as I said when we were talking about Obama, is that I'm hopeful that people are tiring a little bit of this merry-go-round of information, and that people are learning to tune out the noise of it a little bit. And so, I hope that we can find a way to keep our technology, which of course we will because it's useful to us in so many ways, that we will find out a way to keep this technology and keep it integrated with our lives, but to carve out space in our lives for contemplation and reading a book that's maybe not even about the internet.
Now you can get your copy of And Then There's This by Bill Wasik by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're watching this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. Heardeverything.com is where you can also find my 2011 interview with Andrew Breitbart.
Before the internet, I was a slacker in my early 20s, having graduated college. I resembled the movies. I resembled the articles about Generation X and what are we going to do? And then the internet happened.
and my 1991 conversation with an OG of the news and information world, Charles Osgood.
I take a look at the story, absorb it, try to think, what can I say? What does this remind me of? What's this an example of? What have we here? And what comes out, I hope that I haven't lost the thing that interested me in the story in the first place.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can find us everywhere you find podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, my interview from over 30 years ago now with the Queen of Country, the inimitable Reba McEntire.
People say, well, once you have a number one record, boy, it's easy. That's when the work begins. It was the hard part. It was the hard part getting another number one record. I didn't think I was ever going to get another one.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.